Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, or just welcome if you are new. Jen was kind enough to mention me in her last BookTubers I Love video, and now there appear to be even more of you, so that's exciting. I'm at about 1,000 subscribers, so that's nice. So hello if you are new, my name is Katie, I like Dickens a lot, that's kind of all you need to know. Today I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. I read 9 books in March and I'm going to tell you about them now. So, as usual, to start off with my monthly challenges, for my non-fiction read this month I read this little, very thin non-fiction book called Night Walks by Charles Dickens. So this is part of the Penguin's Great Ideas series, where they basically put together like a lot of little slim volumes of non-fiction by various authors. So this Night Walks is a selection of a couple of Charles Dickens essays. Some are from his longer non-fiction work, and some are from sort of just articles that were published in his magazine and that kind of thing. And they kind of are dealing with life in Victorian London. The first essay, the title essay, Night Walks, in this selection is a description by Charles Dickens of walking around London when he has insomnia and can't sleep, and of the things he sees. And there are various other essays in here which deal with lots of different elements of Victorian society. There's one about the funeral of the Duke of Wellington and how everyone in Victorian society seems to be trying to make money out of this funeral. And there's one about betting shops. There's one about the boat making industry. There's a great essay in here about the workhouse, which I think was the one I found the most interesting. You see in a lot of Charles Dickens's fiction a lot of very strong criticism of the workhouse, especially in stuff like Oliver Twist, and I thought it was very interesting that in this essay, although he is critical of many of the situations within the workhouse, he is much more like respectful of the people who are working there, and he has a lot to say for it being like as good as it can possibly be. Like, it's an awful situation, but the people who are working in this workhouse in Wapping are doing the best they possibly can, and that is an element that is often missing from books like Oliver Twist. So I thought that was really interesting to find in this essay here, and I'm definitely going to be reading more Charles Dickens non-fiction in the future. I've read all his novels and I love them so much, but I haven't actually delved into his non-fiction that much. The essay on the workhouse in here is actually from his longer book, The Uncommercial Traveller, which is a non-fiction book which I'm now very, very keen to read. So at some point in the next year I'll probably be reading that, and I really enjoyed the other kind of essays and articles in this book as well, and I'll certainly be looking out for more Penguin Great Ideas books in the future. Now, my monthly reading challenge from the jar of reading challenges that my friend Celine gave me last year this month was to read a book you gave up on, which I failed. I had very little to pick from for this challenge because basically I don't really give up on books very much, ever. The only book I can think of that I started reading and then stopped is Mill on the Floss by George Eliot, which I started reading on holiday and then just decided I wasn't in the mood and didn't finish it like 3 years ago. I've read a couple of other George Eliot books and I have very mixed feelings about her, so I thought about reading Mill on the Floss this month and then ran out of time. So I might read it next month, or I might just try and read it at some point this year, but yeah, I didn't really succeed with that challenge. But anyway, on to my TBR bowl challenge. If you haven't seen it before, this is my TBR bowl. It is a Dickens bowl. It says in it, "Please sir, I want some more," which is the quote from Oliver Twist, and it has a lot of paper in, so every month I pick out like 2 slips of paper from this bowl. This month I read 3 books from my TBR bowl because last month I only read 1, so I read like that one plus 2 others. So the book I kind of started last month and finished this month from my TBR bowl was this, which is Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson, which is the first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. This is a fantasy series that was recommended to me ages ago by my brother. It's his favourite fantasy series. I wasn't especially fond of it. I found the book very, very confusing. There are a lot of characters and none of them felt that developed to me, and it switches between a lot of characters very rapidly. There are so many people that I found it very hard to engage with anyone, and I found the writing a bit kind of dry and confusing. I can see that it's ambitious, I can see that things might come together more in future books, but I did really struggle with this fantasy book to try and engage with it. It's a very kind of epic story, and I'm all for being thrown in at the deep end in fantasy. I enjoy getting like immersed in the world and not too much like heavy exposition, but I think this went too far the other way. Like, I expect when I read fantasy and sci-fi to not know what's going on for the first 50 pages, but by the time I get to page 400 I want to slightly know what's going on, and I just didn't. I might try and read the second one in this series just to please my brother because he loves them so much and tells me that the second book is much better, but I'm not sure. I didn't especially like this, and then the other fantasy book I read this month, later in the month, I loved so much that that kind of also made this seem even worse, but there we go. Anyway, the next book I pulled out of my TBR bowl was this, which is Some Prefer Nettles by Tanizaki and translated by by Edward Segersticker. I think that's how you say his name, but it's probably not. I did quite enjoy this, though I found it quite odd. It's a Japanese novella from 1929, and it's about this couple who are getting a divorce, and their wife's father is trying to persuade them not to get divorced, and there is this kind of theme going throughout the novella of sort of old Japan versus new Western influences, this kind of conflict between tradition and modernity. I thought it was really interesting in that sense. I thought the dialogue and the writing was all brilliant, but I found the ending very unsatisfying. It felt like it stopped halfway through, and I don't mind ambiguous endings, but this was a little maybe too ambiguous for me. But I really loved his writing style. I've got another book by him, the Makoa Sisters, I think it's called, which is much longer, so therefore might be more satisfying. I don't know. So I'm looking forward to reading that at some point in the future, possibly in June. I might do Japanese June. I'm still deciding. I enjoyed this, but the ending was not necessarily for me. And the third book from my TBR bowl this month was this incredible book, Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, which I loved so much. Like, words cannot describe how much I loved this book. I really, really did fall in love with this story. It was beautiful. So Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson is a book from the 1930s, and it follows this woman, Miss Pettigrew, who is a nursery governess, and she is very poor. She's really struggling. She doesn't have a job. She goes to the employment centre and she gets given a card to call on this woman who is apparently seems to be in need of a nursery governess. And Miss Pettigrew goes to this house, and when she gets there, she gets mysteriously and brilliantly dragged into the world of Miss LaFosse. It's like a less effective Mary Poppins meeting the bright young things from Evelyn Waugh and just deciding to go with it. Like, it's so cool, it's brilliant. This whole book is set in just 24 hours, and I really love that in a book, and it's so dramatic and beautiful, and it's so happy. Like, I read a lot of sad, bleak books, and I often love sad, bleak books, and I love books that, like, kind of break your heart, but the thing I love so much about Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day is it just has such a joy in life and living. Like, there is such happiness and pleasure taken in life in this book, and it's beautiful. It's so lovely. I love this so much. Sticking with the classics, I also read Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. I haven't read any Edith Wharton before. I know that Age of Innocence, I think, is her most famous work, but they didn't have that at the library. They had this, and I'd been thinking about reading something by her for ages, and I thought I would pick this up, and I did really enjoy it. I thought it was really kind of heart-wrenching and powerful in a brilliant, fascinating way. It follows the story of this man called Ethan Frome, who is in an unhappy marriage with a woman who he doesn't really love, and she doesn't really love him, and he kind of becomes infatuated and falls in love with his wife's cousin who comes to stay with them, and it's kind of about their story. I thought it was really kind of tenderly and beautifully written, really sad, but really kind of interestingly constructed. Reminded me of a lot of early 20th century American drama, probably because mostly of the stuff, the American literature I have read from the first half of the 20th century happens to be drama rather than novels or novellas, and it had that kind of tone of tragedy in it that you get in like Tennessee Williams or Eugene O'Neill or Arthur Miller, which I think is really powerful and really great. So yeah, I really liked this. I thought it was really good. I also read Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, which was incredible, and the reason why I read it this month was because next month in April, for Charlotte Bronte's 200th birthday, I want to do a Bronte week, much as I did a Jane Austen week or 2 weeks of Charles Dickens earlier on in the last year, because I want to celebrate the Bronte sisters and go through their novels one by one. This was brilliant. It's more industrial than a lot of the other Bronte novels. It's set in a mill town in Yorkshire, and it's about kind of the industrial strife there, the social issues, as well as about the kind of love stories of these two young heroines who are both very, very interesting heroines, and there's so much interesting proto-feminism in here, as there always is in the Brontes, which just makes me so happy. A very, very good read, as beautiful and heartbreaking and tender as Charlotte Bronte's work always is. She is the master of writing about unrequited love. She writes it so, so brilliantly, and this is very, very good. As I said earlier, I did read another fantasy novel this month, as well as The Gardens of the Moon, and that was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which I had been meaning to read for an incredibly long time. I think my brother told me about this years and years ago, probably nearly like 10 years ago, whenever this came out, and then very recently my boyfriend Nick was telling me to read this and finally persuaded me to actually get it out of the library, and I'm very glad he did, because I love this. I thought it was brilliant. It's absolutely my kind of fantasy novel. Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson was so epic and so concerned with the world and the big drama, the impending doom, that all of the characters were just not interesting at all. This is a much more like personal, smaller fantasy story, which is absolutely what I love. Fantasy has a tendency sometimes to try and be too epic, and to get so epic that it loses all of the beauty in the detail and in individual characters, whereas this absolutely doesn't do this. It's also beautifully, beautifully written. The book is a frame narrative in which a man called Quoth, who used to be this kind of famous sorcerer and is now in hiding as an innkeeper, he tells his life story to a chronicler who has come to visit him. A lot of this book is concerned with his childhood and his time at the university where he was learning magic. There are 2 more books in this series. One is out, the other is not out yet, which I'm very much looking forward to read. I think they deal much more with Quoth's adulthood. I think one of the things I really love about this is that it's very Dickensian. Like, there is a bit where he lives on the streets and the central character Quoth reminds me a lot of Pip from Great Expectations. There is a lot of kind of Dickensian feeling in here. It feels like that kind of Bildungsroman of a fantasy novel, which I really enjoy personally. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I will do a full review on my blog probably in the next week, which I will put up, because there are 1 or 2 like little issues which I wanted to talk about more. One of the things I found curious in this book was his presentation of women. The fantasy world, the society that Quoth lives in, is quite a sexist one, and Quoth is not as sexist as his society, but he is still at times a bit sexist and at times kind of idealises women. There's a lot of like, oh, I don't understand women, I was a young boy, I did not understand women, and that kind of othering of women at the same time as idealising them, which can be a bit frustrating, but it's very hard to tell whether that is Quoth, the character's representation of women, or whether that is the author's representation of women. But anyway, I will think about that more in the future and when I read the second book. But in general, I did really like this. I think it's one of my favourite fantasy books I've ever read. Really strong, beautiful writing and a great plot. I also read The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This I listened to on audiobook. It was recommended to me by my boyfriend and I loved it so much. I have read American Gods. That's the only other thing I've read by Neil Gaiman, which Nick also recommended to me, and I liked it, but it took me a long time to get into, and I found it very unsettling, and I really, although I did like it ultimately, I still had like some slight reservations about it, or I wasn't sure that it was quite for me. But The Ocean at the End of the Lane was absolutely for me. I thought it was so beautiful. Like, from the first like half an hour listening to an audiobook, it was just incredible. Neil Gaiman narrates the audiobook himself. It's on Audible, and it's just so good. Like, his voice and the way he voices all the characters is so brilliant, and it's just done so well. So The Ocean at the End of the Lane, it's about this young boy who is about 7, and various mysterious supernatural things start to occur around the place where he lives. His parents' lodger commits suicide, and after that, strange things start to occur. Magic realism, supernatural kind of stuff going on, and the boy, the narrator, he befriends this girl who lives quite nearby called Letty Hemstock, who lives with her mother and her grandmother. They have this pond a little away from their house, which Letty Hemstock, this 11-year-old girl, refers to as an ocean, and it is clear from the beginning that there is something magical about them. It is not a children's book, even though it is about a 7-year-old boy. It is very dark, but it is so brilliant and beautiful and powerful, and I think like the Hempstocks as a family are some of my new favourite literary characters. I love this book so much. I really fell in love with Neil Gaiman's writing style in a way that I didn't with American Gods. I thought it was so beautiful and brilliant, and there were just so many amazing things about this book. I can't recommend it enough. I thought it was really, really good. And finally, I read The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie. My first Agatha Christie. I had been meaning to read Agatha Christie for so long because I always enjoyed the TV adaptations, the films. They always feel like Christmas to me because I think we always used to watch one at Christmas when I was a child. So I got this out of the library because it was the shortest one that was a Miss Marple mystery, and I've always preferred Miss Marple in the TV adaptations to Poirot, so I got this out. I feel slightly gutted that Miss Marple does not appear until page 223 in this 300-page novel. She's barely in it. I don't know if that's normal in an Agatha Christie Miss Marple novel. I don't know if normally she's very absent from the book and just kind of turns up to solve the mystery, or if actually in general she's much more present. I'm curious to know if you have read much other Miss Marple Agatha Christie. However, despite the fact that I was very disappointed not to have more of Miss Marple knitting in a corner while solving murders, I still thought this was absolutely brilliant and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to be reading more Agatha Christie in the future because it's so readable, so readable. I read this in 3 hours and it was delicious because you just run through it so fast. It's about a man who's a pilot who has been injured. To recover from this injury, he moves with his sister to this small town, and in this small town there are a lot of anonymous letters going round, kind of implying sort of salacious gossip about various people, and then one of these anonymous letters triggers someone to commit suicide, and everything kind of goes on from there in a very complicated way. I really enjoyed the mystery plot. I didn't guess it. I found it unpredictable, which I really really liked, and I really enjoyed like the characters and all of the other plots, like the subplots and the kind of romantic subplots going on along with the mystery. All in all, I thought it was such a nice, pleasant, easy, brilliant read. I say pleasant, it's about murder, but you know what I mean. There's something comforting about those kind of murder mysteries, I think, and I am very, very excited to read more Agatha Christie in the future. When I go to the library to give this back, I'm definitely going to try and get out another Agatha Christie, but it was great. It was very good. More Agatha Christie for me in the future. So yes, those are all the books that I have read in the month of March. Please let me know what you have been reading in the month of March, and if you have read any of the books I have mentioned and what you thought of them, etc. I'll be back on Monday with another video. In the meantime, happy reading.